With just a few phrases from Paul's letter to the Galatians, we get a sort of crash course on the meaning of Christmas, the meaning of Christ's incarnation for our salvation. A big topic, deceptively hidden in just these few verses that we've read. We get from Paul here an explanation of the role of the law, of faith, and of how Christ's arrival transforms our relationship with God. Now, it's very easy to misread Paul here. Oftentimes, we will find ourselves reading into Paul this idea that the Jewish law was this burden, and a futile one at that. Because ultimately, this law only condemns and does not save. And so with this idea of the law in mind, many will say, how lucky for all of us that Christ came and undid the law, freeing us from such worries. Now all we need to do is have faith, and that will save us without any need for following all those pesky and complicated rules from the Old Testament. That's a common view of the law and faith, but there are a couple of problems with it. First of all, we have Jesus himself in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew telling us that he did not come to abolish the law. And then if we look at the Old Testament itself, especially if we look to the Psalms, we will be quickly disabused of this notion of the law as a burden. Notice our psalm reading today. It ends with an alleluia in response to God's statutes being revealed to them. A really clear case of this can be seen in Psalm 119 in particular. That psalm is all about praising the gift of the law. The psalmist sings, "I rejoice in following your statutes as one rejoices in great riches. I meditate on your precepts and consider your ways. I delight in your decrees. I will not neglect your word." The law being described here is no burden, but a blessing. It's guidance from God on living into this special relationship. You can even see this sense of the law in the Galatians reading once you know what to look for. You see, Paul's reference to the law being a disciplinarian is not meant to have the negative connotations we might attach to that word. A disciplinarian in the ancient world was not a mean taskmaster responsible just for doling out punishments, but a tutor responsible for teaching a child, for helping to raise them into a responsible adult. For the law to be a disciplinarian here meant that its purpose was to guide the people in their growth towards God. Not a bad thing at all. Okay, so if the law is a tutor, what is Paul's point here in his letter? Why is he contrasting the law and faith? What are we to make of this language that suggests we've been freed from the law? Well, what Paul is driving at here is that the arrival of Christ signals the salvation of the whole world, both the Jew and the Gentile. The mistake that Paul is urging the Galatians to avoid is to then impose the law onto these Gentiles, to try and make it necessary for Gentiles to first become Jewish before extending the offer of Jesus' salvation to them. That's what would turn the law into a burden, to make the law a precursor to salvation, to following Christ, rather than its original intention of serving as a guide and a sign of the faith that the Jewish people have in God. What Paul wants for the Galatians to recognize is that with the arrival of the Messiah, the Gentiles can now receive those same benefits that the Psalms say alleluia to through their faith. They can receive it through sharing in Christ's faith, through sharing in the faith of the one who fulfills the law, who shows us as the ultimate tutor, the ultimate disciplinarian, how to grow ever closer to God. So Paul then goes on in this letter to explain how this works. It all begins with Abraham and his covenant with God, this covenant that passes down to his descendants, the Jewish people. In covenant with God, following the law, they have the opportunity to serve as a priestly people to the wider world, to demonstrate what a life lived in covenant with God can be like. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of this role, of this covenant, of this promise that God made to Abraham. From the Jewish people comes the Messiah, the Christ. And Jesus, as the Christ, fulfills perfectly that priestly role. He demonstrates in his own life perfectly what it looks like to live totally and utterly dedicated to God, to fully live into this covenant, to completely follow the law. And part of fulfilling this role is to fulfill one of the promises that God made to Abraham. For God promised that not only would Abraham's descendants be more numerous than the stars in the sky, but that through Abraham's descendants, the entire world would be reconciled. And so Paul points out Jesus has come from the Jewish people to save everyone, to invite the whole world into becoming inheritors of this promise from God. And so here in Paul's letter is why Christmas is of such importance. In it, we Gentiles find an opportunity to move into a closer relationship with God than was ever before possible. By becoming human, God elevates our human nature into divinity and invites us through baptism to follow Christ into this renewed creation, being adopted as children of God. What this does not mean is that we've somehow superseded or replaced the Jewish people. We are joining the family, not replacing it. For God's covenant with them is always in effect. God does not break God's promises. And it's that faithfulness to promises, that commitment to keeping covenants, that is indeed good news. For it's what makes this Christmas season possible at all. And so now Paul tells us it is time to trust in the promise that God has made to you, to have faith in He who fulfills the law.